Hello and welcome to the final Sketchfab live stream of the year. This month, my name is Tom. I am part of the community team at Sketchfab, and this month we are going to be looking at an introduction to the Sketchfab Viewer API. And if you're not familiar with what an API is or what it can do, this is the stream for you. We're going to come in and cover kind of all the basics to give you an idea of what you could do in terms of making your 3D models that you've uploaded to Sketchfab have more interactions or custom interactions and do interesting things. And we're joined on the stream by Klaas Nienhuis, and he is a Sketchfab master and an expert on the Sketchfab API. And I'll introduce him fully in just a few seconds. But before we do that, a few little announcements. If you are looking for something to do over the holidays, we are once again running 3 December, Sketchfab 3 December, and this is the 5th year we've run 3 December. And if, again, you're not familiar, 3 December is 21 days from the 1st to the 21st of December, and each day we publish a prompt to challenge you to create a 3D model every day for 21 days. So the full list is up on the blog that we've just published. There's a link to that in the description to this video. And so if you're looking to keep a creative habit going over the holidays, then do check that out. That's all the major announcements really. So please do like, subscribe, follow us here, follow us on social media, check out the Sketchfab blog for all updates and news from Sketchfab. And then please do drop any questions about this stream into the chat, and Abby, who is working behind the scenes, will get the questions to us, and we'll do a Q&A at the end of the stream. Okay, without further ado, I would like to introduce Klaas. Klaas lives in Schiedam. Am I getting that right? Schiedam?
No.
No.
Schiedam.
Schiedam in the Netherlands, and he's running a development company that deals mostly with 3D related projects, such as 3D configurators and 3D tooling for 3ds Max. His first steps into 3D as a kid were with the level editor of Duke Nukem 3D. Pretty old school, I like it. For about 10 years, Klaas has been running his own business, creating scripts and interactive experiences for clients all over the world. Klaas handles scripting for 3ds Max himself and works together with a team of developers and designers to create web projects. And you can check out some of his examples of his work over at klaasnienhuis.nl, and there are links to Klaas's website in the description as well. So welcome, Klaas, and thank you for joining us for this stream.
Thanks for having me, Tom.
It's going to be to set everyone's expectations for this stream. What are we going to kind of be covering, and how are we going to be coming at it?
Well, we're going to do the first steps of API development. So we will be embedding a Sketchfab model into a web page. And after that, we are going to manipulate that model by showing and hiding and moving an object. We'll be working in CodePen. That just takes away some of the boilerplate stuff so that we don't have to develop the entire website. But in the end, all the code examples will be on CodePen for you, and you can export that code, and they will be fully functional websites. So HTML, JavaScript, and CSS. But our focus will be mostly the JavaScript part. HTML and CSS will be pretty basic and really not that important to focus on.
Okay, so we're going to be looking directly at the API and what we can do with it, and then for anyone looking to kind of make their web page or experience that a bit more interesting, that can look up. There are plenty of resources. Maybe I'll put a link in the description for that as well. And so for anyone who's not familiar with an API, Application Programming Interface, am I getting that right?
Yeah.
Because I'm not a developer, let me describe it and let's see if I'm close. So
Sure.
when I think of an API, I think of basically you have a platform like Sketchfab or I don't know, YouTube or another platform, and there's obviously the website that you can interact with all of the content on. But then the API allows you to connect to the platform and manipulate the content using code and setting up kind of an app to then do something. Is that close?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So the API allows you to talk to a Sketchfab model without having to press buttons. And that's what you want to do when you put a Sketchfab model on your own site. You're not going to put a mini Sketchfab website on your site because that's way too much. You just want a model and then maybe some interactions with it. So then you will need to have some software to talk to, and that software is the API.
Perfect. Okay, well, I think then, without further ado, we can start getting into looking at some coding. Do you want to begin with the first example, or should we look at the 3D
Yep.
model first?
Let's go with the first example, and then we can go into the 3D model.
Okay.
I will start sharing my screen for that. So unless I'm told otherwise, I'm assuming this screen is up.
Looking great.
Thank you. So we will be working with this 3D model that Tom prepared. It is by Harley Teresi, licensed under Creative Commons, and we'll be using this model. It's light and it works really fast. Like I said, we will be working in CodePen, and that's a coding environment that takes away some of the burden of creating websites. And in the end, you can go here to the right at the bottom, and then there are several export options to get the code. All the code that we will be creating is also featured as a CodePen collection with 4 different lessons, so you can really go step by step. So the first thing that we want to do is actually just make that model show up here. This here is a HTML page, and it's empty right now. And we will need to do several things. When you want to show a Sketchfab model on your website, you need to put it in an iFrame. That's basically HTML speak for putting a website in another website. And I am going to copy and paste some code here. It is an iframe and it has an ID. That ID is important, and I will tell you later why. And there's a class. I will cover that later. So, and you'll see that immediately there that iframe will show up here. It's a frame, and it's empty. And let's see if my settings here are good. Yes. So the second thing that we will need to do is make sure that we actually tell our website where that Sketchfab API is.
Klaas, can I just check with you? Because we're seeing right now quite a few windows on your desktop. So I'm not wondering if you're on the right, sharing the right screen, because I can't see if you were manipulating things. I wasn't sure.
Yes. Well, I'm probably doing this wrong. Hold on. Other screen. So you see, I am a live stream beginner.
Hey, there we go. That looks a lot cleaner. So I'll
right.
Just
move, so what I said, the iframe. This is the HTML object that we need to place other websites in our website. So you see that iframe showing up here, and it has an ID, which is called API-frame, and that's important, and I will explain later. So the first thing is done. We've got an iframe. The second thing is that we need to tell our website where to find this Sketchfab API. We can't just start talking about the Sketchfab API in our website and assume that the site will know what it is. It doesn't. So for that, you will head over to the developers documentation on sketchfab.com. It is sketchfab.com/developers. And there you will see all kinds of API related stuff. We will be working with the Viewer API. That's the API that we will dealing with. So let's click on that. The first link that we see here is a link to the Sketchfab Viewer API. And this is actually a URL that we can copy. So copy link. And then if we go to our settings in CodePen, we can add this as an external script. And when you would be developing your HTML yourself, this would be a script tag that you would add at the top of your site. So the API, Sketchfab API, is now added into our website. Nothing has changed in the website. We're just telling about where to find this API. Next step would be to make the model show up in the website. And I'm just going to refer back to the documentation because all those steps are actually described here. And there are some full HTML examples here, but we're going to do this step by step. So I'm going to scroll down all the way down and go to this link, the initialization and options. That's the first step what you will do. Here are the two code examples that we will need. And I'm just going to copy paste these and discuss them one by one.
Just before you do that, in terms of, so somebody who is completely new necessarily to API, maybe you know a bit about building websites. Do you find that using the documentation that Sketchfab provides, is that kind of the easiest way to get into it, doing some copying and pasting rather than trying to kind of manually write everything each time? Is that fair to say? Copying and pasting is a useful part of building these.
Absolutely. And during our live stream, we will be doing exactly that. Although I will be rewriting some of this stuff. But as you can see, while we were talking, I just copy paste those two examples and we get a model here. And so actually we're done now, right? This example.
Okay. Stop the stream.
Yeah, so stop the stream. So the example works. And I'm going to tell you what happens because it's important to understand what we're doing to make sure that we can actually continue on the right path. So the first three lines. First, I need to stop auto-saving here. That's it. So the first three lines. First, we need to get a reference to our iFrame. And remember that we called this iFrame, we gave it an ID with iFrame. So in the JavaScript code, we can now ask the website, okay, do you remember that iFrame that we put in there with this name? Let's get a reference to it so that we can use it later. This is a version of the API. There were many versions of the Sketchfab API before this, but we're targeting a specific API version, and that's useful because, you know, maybe Sketchfab will introduce some changes in the future. Maybe they're breaking changes. And then it's important that we work with a specific API version that we know that works today. Well, and here comes the first thing that we are talking, where we're talking to Sketchfab. We are actually we are creating a Sketchfab Viewer instance. I'm not sure how to describe this more, you know, in other terms, but actually, so we're asking Sketchfab, and we know where Sketchfab is because we had this URL. We're asking to create a new Sketchfab instance here.
Okay, so we had an empty iFrame that had no website in it, and so does this? Am I right in saying this line will kind of get an empty Sketchfab viewer almost, but it won't kind of do anything until we tell it more?
Yes, exactly. So here we say, so instead of going to sketchfab.com, you get your own little sketchfab.com right here. And because we say attach it to the iFrame, the Sketchfab site will appear where we put that iFrame.
Okay.
And that is called the client. That's what it's usually called. You can call it anything you want, but you know, commonly this is referred to as the client. We're going to ignore this line here. And so what happens next is that we want to initialize that client. We want to say, okay, client, let's load something. Let's go. And what are we going to load? There are three things that we are doing. So we are loading a specific model UID. So these are, when you go to a Sketchfab model, you usually in the navigation bar, you see an ID like this. That's the ID that you need. And just for kicks, I'm going to copy this ID and put it in here. And then save my code. And there you go. I use the model ID of that model that we just looked at. And instead of the Bob character, we now have our chest. And I'm going to also, well, never mind. So that's the first thing. Then we will tell Sketchfab what to do with that model. And there are two things that can happen. There could be a success or there could be an error. So Sketchfab gives us two options. So first, if there is success, let's run a JavaScript function. If there's an error, let's run another JavaScript function. And if there's an error, we just print out to the console, there's an error. And if there's success, we're actually doing two things. We tell the API to start. You saw that when the model loads, there's this black and white play button. We actually tell Sketchfab, okay, skip that step, just start the model. And then we have to wait for Sketchfab to do anything with that model until Sketchfab tells us, okay, now the model is loaded. This is really important to keep in mind. These models, this model is maybe not super heavy, but it takes a little while to load, 1 or 2 seconds. And before that model has finished loading, you cannot do anything with it. So we cannot show and hide objects. We cannot show or change materials. So we ask Sketchfab to tell us whenever you're ready, then we can continue with what we want to do.
Okay, that makes sense. So if you did ask it to do something, it would say, well, I don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah, it would just not react. Or you would get errors because you would have made assumptions that stuff was ready while it wasn't there. For instance, if you would ask Sketchfab, hey, tell me what objects are in the scene, before those objects actually have loaded, the API will say, well, I'm sorry, that's an error.
Okay.
So this is our first step. And I'm going to make this slightly more pretty to look at by just copy and pasting some CSS in here. And I'm not really going to explain this. It will just make sure that this model is shown full screen.
Nice.
So it will just make sure that the model is full screen, but it doesn't affect the functionality of this model anymore.
Awesome. I'll just mention as well, I know you gave credit to Harley Teresi about this 3D model, but there's also a link to the 3D model, the original 3D model, in the description as well, if you want to check out this particular 3D model.
Excellent. So I'm really bothered by this. Just 1 second. Okay, we're not going to auto update the code. So anytime I type something in, then the sketch or the site updates. That's quite annoying.
Okay.
So I'm going to do a little bit of rewriting, and that allows us to repeat what we have done. So I'm going to separate some of these things into functions, and that makes it easier to work with later on. So I'm going to write a separate success function. That's really practical. And then we will be able to use that success function later on. The success function that Sketchfab expects us to put here has one argument, and that is the Sketchfab API object. That object is super important. Anything that we want to do with the API, we will have to talk to that API and use that object. So that means that now, in our case right now, we can work with it like this, but when you build a larger website, you probably want to store that API object somewhere for easier reference. Okay, so this success function here works, and I'm just going to replace all this code here with my success function. save my code, and then run. And this will also show that I've left something out. Okay, that now you see when I start typing my own code, I make errors. That's, well, kind of, coding is mostly making errors. Right, here we are. So you see, for instance, a nice thing that you see is when the model loads, and pay attention to when the model loads, you see that it changes slightly. So low-res textures, and after a while, you get high-res normals and high-res textures. There are many more things that could happen and how this model can behave, but there are lots of options that Sketchfab offers to influence this. And I want to show you where to do that because we will, you will be probably using that in the future as well. So in the documentation, we are now in the initialization and options page. There's actually a long list of options or parameters that you can give Sketchfab when it's loading the model. Lots of options, right? And I encourage you to read them. Some options are available to all accounts. Other options are only for certain paid accounts. But what these options do is they determine how the model loads and also how the viewer behaves and what it looks like. For instance, in this viewer here, I've got a Tom's account information on the top left, got a Sketchfab icon on the top right. I've got a stop button here on the top right. And we've got this behavior that when the model loads, the textures refine over time. And there's a camera movement. So pay attention once more. When you load the model, actually the model kind of floats into view. So for no particular reason, I want to change some of these behaviors. And of course, I know all these by heart, not really, but I've prepared some. So for instance, I want to get rid of this stop button because once the model is loaded, people need to look at it. So there's an option called UI stop. And there are two options for this. I can set it to 1 or 0. When I set this to 0, that stop button is removed. There's another option called preload. Preload means that all the stuff that's in the Sketchfab model, such as textures, will be actually loaded before the model is shown. Now again, there's an option 0 or 1. I want this model to preload, so let's set it to 1. And finally, I don't like this camera movement for this live stream. I want the model to just appear in this position. So there's an option called camera. Again, you can set it to 1 or 0. And if you set it to 0, the camera movement is omitted. So let's have a look if this works. There we are. Okay. So there's no change in texture. It's just all there. It doesn't mean that Sketchfab is loading faster. It will just wait a little bit longer before it shows us the model. There was no camera movement, and here on the top right, the stop button is gone.
Nice. So if you were embedding, say, a model, I don't know, maybe you're trying to sell something or using Sketchfab for e-commerce, that you could customize the viewer all through code, maybe white label it, remove all the options, make things look nice and clean for your website.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. So if you put this on a commercial site or e-commerce, like you said, you probably want to get rid of all the stuff and just have people focus on the model. Another thing could be, if you're working on e-commerce and you put this on a product page and your model is really heavy, you could also ask the Sketchfab viewer for not to start playing the model until somebody pushes the play button.
Okay.
That would avoid a long loading time, or maybe you've got 10 Sketchfab models on a page for a particular reason. You probably don't want to have all 10 loading at the same time.
Right.
Just have one loading and the other ones could kind of pause.
Okay.
All right. So this was our first step, getting a model to show up on your page. So we're quite successful already. Our second step will be that we want to manipulate that model. We want to get rid of the lid in our case. We could do anything with it, but our lesson here is the lid, and we want to remove it. And let's just wait a little bit until we actually show the model. Tom, I want to finish this lesson, and then we're going to do something else with it. So
Okay.
Removing this lid, we need to ask Sketchfab what's that model called, or how do I remove it? So there is a Sketchfab function. Well, just pardon me. Step back. If we want to now we've initialized our model. If we want to start working with it, we need to go to the next developer page, which is called the API page.
Okay.
So let's don't take it too quickly here. And on this API page, you will see all the things that you can do with the model. Change materials, work with annotations, do stuff with animations, lights, background, environments, etc. We're working with an object. So there is a practical link here. Let's go to objects. And the first 4 items are relevant to this lesson. So let's first say, if we want to hide an object, this is the function how you can hide an object, and it's called api.hide. And it expects a node, and it actually expects a node ID. And in Sketchfab, objects have a so-called instance ID. That's the identifier of the object. And Sketchfab makes sure that these IDs are unique. So that if you have 1,000 objects in your scene, Sketchfab makes sure that none of these IDs are the same, so that if you want to hide one particular object, that other objects don't get hidden by accident.
Can I maybe ask a silly question now then?
Yes.
So when we're referring to these instance IDs, they're assigned to separate geometries in your 3D scene. Is that correct? Or is it related to, for example, materials? Like, if you had a model with different parts, would you want to separate them via geometry or via the material that you've assigned to them?
Yeah, well, that depends on what you want to do. If I want to do things with objects, for instance, showing and hiding, then I'm going to look at the object IDs.
Right.
And if I want to change materials, then I would look at object or material IDs.
Okay.
Sketchfab treats these differently. It is really easy to, instead working with material IDs, it's much easier to work with material names. And those names are the names that you created in your 3D software, such as Blender.
Okay.
That doesn't work for objects. And because there's not only the geometries in the model here, but there's an entire hierarchy. There are lots of objects in the Sketchfab scene that you actually don't want to work with. And all these objects get IDs. That's why it's a little bit harder to work with. And I'm going to show you why.
Okay.
So first of all, I'm going to extend my success function here. So instead of saying that the Sketchfab API has started, I'm going to add some more code. Oops. So first of all, crap, I'm now doing things wrong here. First of all, we need to ask Sketchfab, okay, are you done yet? So that's the viewer ready listener. So I'm going to add event listener, and there are many event listeners that we can use with Sketchfab, but this one was called the viewer ready. And this is the same event listener that we just copied and pasted previously. So I'm just typing it again. Right. So before we can work with these instance IDs. We need to know what are these instance IDs, because we are not making them up. Sketchfab is making them up. And each time you upload the model, these instance IDs could be different. So you can't rely on finding the instance ID today and using that same ID tomorrow after you maybe added another object. So instance IDs are important to work with, but they can't be relied on to stay the same at all times. So before we can get the instance ID, we need to find them. And that's what this function is for, get node map. The node map is a list of all the nodes objects in Sketchfab, and it will print out a whole bunch of information about them, including the instance ID. So I'm just going to copy and paste this function. And it says, well, get the node map. And once you're done, and if there's no error, just print those nodes out to the console. And then we'll see what we can do with them. So I'm going to run this function. Wait for the model to load. And so in the CodePen console, some stuff is printed, but this is not all. There's too much. So you would have to open the browser console. And that's usually Control-Shift-I or Command-Shift-I. And it will give you something like this, the console. And here is the object that has been printed. And this is super interesting and quite often also a source of confusion. So these are all the objects, all the nodes that are in the Sketchfab scene. And I know that this scene has two objects. There's a lid and a base, but Sketchfab has more than that. So there are 2, 4, 6, 8, there are about 10. So what are all these things? So I know that we're going to look for the lid. So I'm just going to expand the lid nodes, the 2 lid nodes. And there are 2 types here. One object is called lid, and it's a group. The other object is called lid_0, and that's a matrix transform type. I'm just going to tell you, matrix transform is what we need. That's the object that we need. And that's usually for most operations that you want to do, that is the thing that you need, matrix transform. So the other lid object, that's a group, that's probably a parent of this one. It does other things. It makes sure that the scene worked right, but it's not the object that we need. You can't hide a group, but you can hide a matrix transform object.
Okay.
Take it from me. And
no, I think that's good. I think it's good for this stream to maybe not dive into every single thing. Yes. So that's good to hear.
And you see that this one has the instance ID of 3. And well, you can see them here. There's the base. Base 1 is instance ID 35. And that's all really cool. So now we know that if we want to hide this lid, because that's what I want to do, I need to find an object with the name lid0 and then get its instance ID. I'm not going to store this instance ID or use it directly because I know it can change anytime. So I'm going to work with object names because that's what you could have control over. You know, Tom, used this model. He made sure that this object was called lid and not ASDF whatever. So the object name is super important. And I know now it needs to be lid0. So let's remember that and close this browser console. So I'm going to remove this here. So here we have this array, or actually it's not an array, it's an object. We've got this object called nodes, and we need to find the node with the name lid0. Keep in mind the nodes that I get from this function, it's not an array, but it's an object. Arrays in JavaScript makes it really easy to search things. Objects a little bit more convoluted. So I'm going to type this in. So constant lid is object dot values, node. So this part here makes it possible for me to go over the node object by treating it as an array.
Okay.
Now I'm going to find an item where the item name is the same as, and what was that name again?
Lid_0.
Lid_0.
I think you may have left out an S in your constant as well for the lid.
Yes. There we are.
Okay.
So now we've got this reference here, and just to make sure that we are good, I'm going to print out typing and talking is hard.
I've got it easy. I can just watch and then tell you about your typos.
So I'm getting the node map, but only once Sketchfab tells us they're ready. Once I've got this node map, I'm going to find an object with the name lid0. And once I've got that lid, I'm going to print it out to the console just to make sure that we're good to go. I'm going to clear this out, save my code, and run this. So I'm actually not looking at the model right now. I'm looking here. And there we are. There's one object printed out. It's called lid0, and there's all this information, super important and interesting, but actually it's the instance ID that we want.
Okay.
So right now we've got the lid, so we can go back to the documentation here and go to this hide function. I'm just going to copy and paste this because I can. And I'm going to get rid of all this stuff that prints out stuff when there's an error. And it says API.hide and then my node, and we know we have to feed it an instance ID. So I'm going to say a lid.instance ID. That's basically it. Run again. So right now, the model should load and then hide the lid. And there we are.
Okay, and that's almost instantaneous then.
Yeah, and that's a good point. Almost instantaneous. It is not instantaneous. So let's say that you're doing a lot of this hiding and showing, and it takes a little while. Then it is up to you, for instance, to create a loading screen if you want to hide that process until Sketchfab is done. And for showing and hiding objects, that's usually not so much of an issue. But for changing materials, that can get quite heavy, even especially if there are textures being loaded.
Right, right. And just to make it clear, where we've asked the API to hide the lid, you've chosen to use lid.instance ID as opposed to just typing the number 3 in there.
Yeah.
Because
yes.
would it work if we type 3, but then
yes.
the instance ID might be different if we go away, edit that 3D model, change something.
Exactly. So this also works. And if you know that this model isn't going to change, this, of course. Why am I'm always trying to fix things by typing, but then I break it. I'm just going to replace this here. Yeah, that's part of my day. So okay. You see, this works. It is a lot less flexible, because if I want to hide the base instead of the lid, I would then have to get that node map again, look up the number of the lid of the base, and then use that instead of just typing in base underscore whatever it was.
Mm-hmm.
So
okay.
I would strongly discourage you from using instance IDs directly in your code, because you never know what can happen to them.
Okay.
So our next step will be to, instead of hiding this lid, is when the model loads, is we want to hide this lid whenever we click the model.
Okay.
Because that's fun. And we also want to show the model again whenever we click the model. So it's kind of a toggle that we want to that we want to put in.
Okay.
I'm going to add a small function that I prepared just to make it a little bit easier for me to work with the code. And this function is also in the code that you can download. So, you know, this part here where I get the object by its object ID, I just have a separate function from there. And where I not only check if the name is correct, but I also make sure that the type is matrix transform, just to make sure that that this stuff works for me. So I'm going to remove this here and replace get node by name lit underscore 0. So right now, this is the same code that we had before, just wrapped in a different function.
Okay.
And now I'm going to add a click event. And let's go to the Sketchfab documentation again and look those up. So if we go to the events here, these are most of the events that Sketchfab supports. So we already had this one, the viewer ready event. And an event is kind of a, instead of us telling Sketchfab to do something, an event is Sketchfab telling us that something has happened.
Right.
For instance, a click, because we can't tell Sketchfab, hey, I'm clicking, but Sketchfab can tell us, hey, I feel I'm being clicked. That's kind of the process. So that's
okay.
That's an event. So there are several. If the viewer is ready, that's an event. If somebody clicks the model, that's an event. If an animation starts playing, that's also an event.
Okay, okay.
We're going to use the click event. Right, so there's a whole bunch of information here. And I'm going to copy and paste this code, but I'm going to put it in a separate function because that's a bit easier to manage in code. So I'm going to create my own function at click event. That's it. And now I have to define that function. Const add event. And I want to feed it the API object because we always need the API object to be able to do stuff with the API. And here in this function, I'm going to copy and paste my event listener, which is the click event listener. I'm going to save this code and I'm going to run it and just see what happens. Because these examples here in the documentation, they actually do things. They don't do what we want because, you know, why would they? So the lid isn't disappearing anymore because we removed that code for the time being. But when I now click the model or anywhere on the iFrame, I get information. You see here, click at, and these are screen coordinates. So that is that's really interesting. And if I click a node, I actually get the instance ID. And here it becomes interesting. That's why I said, well, working with these instance IDs is not that straightforward. We know that our lid object has the instance ID 3, but when I click on it, I get the instance ID 16. What's up with that? So that's the difference between matrix transform objects and group objects and other types of objects. So the matrix transform object, which is the object that we can work with, cannot be clicked.
Okay.
Yeah, that's probably information for a later time live stream. But we do know that the iFrame has been clicked. So that's something that we can work with. And we do not need any of the other information that we get from Sketchfab. So how does this work? There's an event listener. We ask for the click event. So whenever there's a click event, we ask it to run this function with one argument info. So I'm going to just remove this stuff in here. And then there is a type of clicking, and we're using the big slow option. Read up on that in the documentation, please. So whenever the Sketchfab iFrame has been clicked, this function is being run. So, why not say, okay, API hide, and then we can say instance ID. What instance ID was that? So I need to put that in an argument here, and then I need to tell that function, we'll say lit.instance ID.
Okay.
So what's happening here? I'm starting the API. I'm waiting until that API is ready. Then I'm getting all the list of nodes in the API. And then once that list is there, I'm searching it for an object called lit_0. Once I have that, I feed it to an event that I've created. And that event says, well, if I'm clicked, just hide that object.
Okay.
So all these steps, and they're all nested. So they wait for each other. And only once everybody's done, I can do this click event. So I'm going to save this code and run it. Isn't this fun, Tom?
Well, honestly, this is because I've dabbled with JavaScript, but just kind of having you take me through kind of the different parts. What normally, if I saw that code just so, I would have a really tough time understanding what's going on. But like hearing you kind of go through, the layers, the kind of almost the path.
Well, we have
makes
an
sense.
error here. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So I forgot to give my function that finds the nodes. I forgot to give it actually the list of nodes. So
Okay.
there you go.
I suppose another thing is that to do some really cool stuff, and maybe if we've got time, Klaas, you might be able to show some of your work. You kind of have to understand how the API works before you can get crazy creative and start doing really complicated things. So this is exactly, I think, what this stream is about.
Sure, I'd love to. So nothing is happening, and now I click the iframe, and the model is disappearing. Super cool. It doesn't reappear. So I'm just going to fix that really quickly, and then we'll go over the model specifically, Tom, and then
Okay.
we're going to move this lid. So
Okay.
I want to hide and show the lid. So when the lid is shown and I click it, I want to hide it. When the lid is hidden and I click it, I want to show it.
Okay.
So I need to remember if this lid is visible or not, because the Sketchfab API cannot really tell us if things are hidden or not. We need to keep track of that ourselves. So I'm going to create a variable. And I'm going to initialize this to a value true. So this variable is called isVisible. And it's true because when the model starts, the lid is visible. So it makes sense to start it here. And then I'm going to say, okay, well, if is visible. So if the lid is there, is true, what should we do then? We'll hide it.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Now comes the million-dollar question. Else, so if the model lid is not visible, what should we do?
Can we show it? Is there a show function?
Well, yes, there is. So that's
Phew.
instance ID. And I will show you the show function, of course. So, all jokes aside, that function is there. It's called show, and these are documented. And it uses the same methods or the same pattern as hide. So it takes an instance ID. And if a model is already shown and you ask it to show again, that's fine. Nothing will happen, but there's no error involved. So finally, what we need to do is we need to remember that we have hidden or shown the model. So we need to change the value of this variable. So, and that looks like this. Something like this is visible. Is not is visible. This is a kind of a shorthand notation that I invert the value of invisible. And I can do that because this is a Boolean value. So it's either true or false. So whenever this value is true, I say exclamation mark is visible, and that means I'm setting it to false. That's kind of a basic JavaScript notation. So let's try this out. No, nothing is happening. I click the model, and the model is hiding, and I click it again, and it's showing again, and again, and so on. So
awesome. And I noticed that you can still navigate around, like rotate the model, and that does not trigger the showing and the hiding.
No, exactly. So clicking, that's a good point. So a click event is an event where the mouse goes down and up within a set period of time. This is probably something that you can set up in your OS. You know, you've got this click speed thing maybe, but so if I click and release, hold and release it, well, so you need to have a certain speed to this clicking. But if I click and then orbit and then release, that counts as dragging, and
right.
then it's not
okay.
working.
Handy.
Okay, well, our next lesson would be that instead of showing and hiding this lid, which is quite unrealistic, is that we want to open it and close it. And for that to happen, we need to take a quick look at the 3D model. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, Thomas, and then you can.
That's right. You can keep sharing, and I'll just I'll move over to my other desktop.
Right. Okay.
And show people. So you can't see, but I'm showing I'm showing the 3D model in Blender, and we've got the bottom half as one object, and the lid is another one. And if I zoom in a bit, you should be able to see this kind of little orange dot. And if I move kind of a little bit, maybe that's a better angle, is you can see where that dot is. This is the pivot point for the lid. So zoom out, this is the lid. The pivot point is kind of in the middle, kind of the width across the chest, but also it's kind of, I've tried to line it up with where these hinges are. So if I just in Blender, I can hit the R key to rotate. I can now start rotating. Obviously, this is not very realistic, but if I locked it to a particular axis, so say I want to just lock it on the x-axis, I can rotate and kind of open and close, or rather rotate this lid, and it's doing it in the right way. If the pivot point was in the center, hang on, if I do that actually, oh no. Pivot, no. Origin, that's the word I'm looking for. Geometry drawing, origin to geometry. So now, zoom in again, the pivot is pretty much in the middle of the volume of the lid. And then if I was to rotate along the x-axis this time, it's just spinning around and it's not rotating in the right place. So your pivot point is very important, especially when you're working with rotations, because that's where the object will rotate from. So then to go back, it's working in the right place. So that's how we've set this model up. We just have the pivot point on the lid set to that spot. Okay, flipping back to you, Klaas.
Thank you. And keep in mind that pivot point, you cannot change it in Sketchfab. So you cannot ask the model to rotate around a different pivot point. You would have to go into the 3D model, change the pivot point, and re-upload it.
Okay.
So that's an important preparation before you start rotating things. So as we have done with the other things, let's just see what the documentation says about rotating objects. So again, we are working with an object. So let's go to the object documentation and look through the functions here. And there is a function called rotate. This is the one that we want. There's another function that can rotate an object. It's called setMatrix. It's a lot more complicated to work with. So we'll be working with the rotate function. And it takes a bunch of information before it can rotate. And let's go over. So first of all, we again need to feed it the instance ID. So we know how to get that. That's good. Then there is a rotate to array. And then there are some options that we can add to the rotation. And finally, there's a callback. And that callback, that's just a function. It can be whatever we want. And that function will be run once the rotation is done. So that's practical if you want to rotate something and then maybe gold appears. So we would do that in the callback function. We're not going to use that function at the moment. So the rotate to array, and here we go. Let me make this a little bit bigger. So the rotate to array is an array containing an angle and 3 axes. These axes are always difficult to work with. You can imagine we are going to rotate the lid not in an arbitrary direction, but we want the lid to rotate around these hinges. And these hinges are aligned on a certain axis. And I know which axis it is, but we're going to pretend that we don't know. And I always find it really hard to predict which axis is pointed in what direction. And this usually also differs per 3D software that you use. If you upload from Blender, or if you upload the same model from 3ds Max, the axes might be aligned differently. And it's not like they're 1 degree off. It's just like they're 90 degree. The z-axis is pointing forward instead of upward. So it's always a little bit of figuring out, and that's fine. And then finally, there are the options. And these options, there are 2 options that we can do. There's the duration that tells us, how long should this rotation take? It's not instant. It can be an animated rotation, which is really cool. And then there's the easing, which is also pretty awesome. Easing, you probably noticed from 3D software or maybe from animation, is if you move an object from A to B, this object has a certain speed, and the easing can modify that speed. For instance, to start slowly and then speed up and then end slowly again. The duration will be the same, just the speed is slightly modified. And there's a whole list of different easings that we can use. We will look at that. So again, we want to do this stuff on click. So that's what we will be working with. And I'm just going to remove my visibility code here, because we don't want to rotate and change the visibility. We only want to rotate the object. So first of all, let's get the copy and paste this function. Save it to format it. So there's API rotate, my node. So my node should be replaced with instance ID. I'm going to leave the angle like this. I'm going to leave the easing here, and this all seems fine. Let's just see if this works out of the box. So I'm going to click. There we are.
Oh, nice.
Well, this is already done almost, but when I click again, nothing happens, because I'm always rotating towards this angle. It isn't, Sketchfab isn't adding these rotations up.
Okay.
Thankfully, because that would make stuff really unpredictable. So that's our alarm here on the outside. Maybe you're hearing it. Nothing is wrong. It's just testing.
Okay, that sounds all right for me.
Okay. And I will show you what happens when I change the axis. So right now we are rotating around the x-axis, but let's say if we're rotating around the z-axis. So this code example is correct by accident, but this would be something that's likely to happen. And now you know how to fix it. And I fixed this by trying. So I just try the different axes until it's right. I'm never capable of predicting what this does. So let's try something out. Again, I need to remember if the lid is open or not.
Mm-hmm.
So let's store a variable again, and let's call this let is open, and we're starting with false. So because the lid is closed, so we say, okay, the lid is closed, it's not open. And before I rotate, I need to determine the angle by which we're going to rotate. And I determined that, oh, my, sorry, all these alarms here. I have to disable this alarm really quickly.
Okay. Thanks. Well, while Klaas is doing that, I hope that everyone's kind of keeping up with what we're doing. But I think it's been so far a very step-by-step approach. So if you are looking to start, obviously you're on this looking at this live stream. If you're looking to work with the API, we'll also put links to the API community, so Discord and the Sketchfab forum, where you can ask questions as well. We'll answer some questions that we have at the end of this stream, but also that's a great place to meet other developers and learn about the API. Klaas is back, so I'll stop filling the airtime.
Yeah. So I have added a function here, or a expression which says, okay, we're calculating the angle by which we want to rotate this lid. So if the lid is open, I want to rotate by 0 degrees. If the lid is closed, I want to open by 90 degrees. I don't want to go all the way, just want to have it 90 degrees. So that will be my angle. I'm going to put this angle in here.
Is it safe to say, in general, with coding and scripting, there's probably more than one way to do most things? That you could achieve things like what we're doing today with different code. But I mean, what I like about what you're showing is that it's pretty logical. But I guess other people may, if they're a bit experienced with JavaScript, they may have a preference for setting things up in different ways. Is that
Absolutely
a fair thing to say?
There's no single way. I mean, Sketchfab forces you to do some things in a specific way. You can't work with the API until it's ready. But how you write that down, and if you separate things into functions, or if you put it all in a long list, that really depends on your coding style also.
Right. Okay.
So we have done a few things while we were talking. So first of all, I'm going to store a variable to keep track if the lid is whether the lid is open or not. Then I have to calculate an angle, because I can't say, well, open or close. Depending on whether it's open or close, I need to calculate an angle. And I'm just feeling lucky, so I say if the lid is open, then is this right? I'm sorry.
Yeah, if it's open, we don't want it to rotate, do we?
Yeah, and if it's closed, then I want to rotate it to open. Thank you. And then I put that angle in here. And then in this callback function, so once that rotation is done, I'm going to say, if the lid was open, now it's closed, or the other way around.
Okay.
So that gives us the opportunity to keep clicking and then open, close, open, close.
Okay. So, nice.
Let's try this out. And if you've been paying attention, I'm making a mistake on purpose. So nothing is happening. I'm opening the lid, and I'm closing it again. So what is happening here? This is not 90 degrees. I'm telling the API explicitly, open 90 degrees. This is not it. So as you might remember, the rotate array takes an angle in radians, not in degrees.
Sneaky.
And, yes, and that is actually with all APIs, all calculations, it's always in radians. It's never in degrees. So of course, if they tell you this is in degrees, then it probably is. But so where a full circle is 360 degrees, in radians, it is 2 pi degrees. So 6.20 whatever. And I'm not going to bother with calculating that each time by hand because no, I don't know, 90 degrees in radians, how much is that? So I just have got a small helper function that says degrees to radians because it's really easier to think in degrees, but in the end you have to convert this to radians.
Nice.
So saving this code here. And this helper function, this is what you will find all over the internet. So this is not, I'm not that clever. So clicking, and here we go. So we are really lucky again because we just guessed some angles and they were correct. It is not a given that the natural state of this model is actually rotated at 0 degrees. And it is not a given that this 90-degree angle is actually 90 degrees. If Thomas had rotated the pivot point by 90 degrees forward, for instance, then our natural state would be 90 degrees and the open state would be 180 degrees. So this is not like, everything you do with the Sketchfab API and rotating stuff, it works naturally. It always happens that, you think you start in a neutral position, actually you don't. So that's, yeah.
And in general, when somebody is developing a configurator or some kind of app with using a Sketchfab 3D model, you'll be working with a 3D artist, and there would be a kind of a bit of back and forth. Most likely, absolutely. I mean, some people can do coding and 3D, but
yeah, exactly. So, assuming that you are going to build a 3D configurator and you need to show and hide parts. That means that you need to know the names of these parts because you can't rely on, instance IDs being stable. So you need to have an understanding with the modeler or the artist, the 3D artist, to say, okay, we have a car, we are going to show the hood, then we will have an object called hood. Okay, and let's keep it that way. Or if you want to make it a little bit more unique, you call it hood class, or give it a name that is kind of stable.
Okay.
And that is important. And the same goes for rotations, etc.
Okay.
One thing that I could say, what's really interesting is right now this lid consists of one single mesh. So we can just ask Sketchfab to rotate a single object. Let's say that this lid was built of multiple meshes, like the steel parts, the nails, the wood. You can ask Sketchfab to rotate all these objects at once, even if you make sure that all the pivot points are in the same place. But what's easier to do is that you make a hierarchy in the scene, so that you have I don't know what it's called in Blender, but in 3ds Max, you can have a point or a dummy node. You give this dummy node the name lid, you put it in the right position, and you make all the meshes that you want to move a child of that.
Okay.
And then you can just say, okay, rotate this lid, and then everything that's a child of it will rotate with it without you having to target lid
individual
steel, lid plank, lid nail. So
okay. Cool.
I could show the bonus scene, and then we can go over to the questions if there are any.
I think that sounds like a good idea.
Yeah. Okay. Excellent. So now that we have all this code of changing or rotating the lid, we can use that exact same code to rotate something else. Because the only thing that you have to do is to change the name of the object, and then we can start rotating again.
Okay.
That's the cool thing of this coding, is that once you've got the mechanics in place, you can rotate a lid, you can rotate a jaw, for instance. So that's what we're doing right here.
Okay.
I can just show you. So most of the code is the same here. So there's the get node by name, and then instead of lid _0, we've got jaw _1, because I figured out this name by looking at the node map. Another change that I have done here, I'm not doing this, I'm not rotating by clicking, but I actually added a slider here. So instead of clicking and then rotating the jaw, I've added a slider and I'm asking the slider, okay, how far are you along? And then I calculate an angle based on that. So here you go. And these angles, these were not 0 and 90 degrees, but these were like minus 140 to minus 90. So I had to figure out these angles.
Okay. So I had set up this model a bit funny this time.
Apparently, yes. Yeah. So you see here, I'm doing some storage of these values here. And so at first my jaw would rotate through the skull and, maybe too far.
Too far. Okay, I should also mention, so this is an edited version of Brown Hyena Skull by the University of Dundee Museum Collections, licensed under Creative Commons attribution. There's a link to this in the description as well. So we're working with the same, that idea of like, okay, we're rotating something via some kind of user interaction.
Yes,
You can then
exactly.
transfer, copy, paste bits and tweak them.
Instead of clicking, I now have got a slider. I could also have added a button. This is the rotate code. It was exactly the same. It's just separated out in a function. And as the final thing, you can also do multiple things at the same time. So I slide the slider and I rotate the jaw, but why not do multiple things at the same time? I can ask Sketchfab to rotate a jaw at the same time that I ask Sketchfab to change the post-processing.
Okay.
And I've made a function that I called it dramatize, and it sets a bunch of post-processing values. And I'm not going to cover those, but you can just target any post-processing function.
I haven't seen this, so I'm looking forward to this.
Yeah, I know you haven't seen this. And so then you can really make the jaw quite scary. So I'm changing
Nice.
the vignette. So you see vignetting happening, chromatic aberration, and color balancing.
Nice, and that's also set so that it's like going through a transition from 0 to 100% of the effect as well.
Yes, so these values are usually going through from 0 to 1. And I am calculating, so the chromatic aberration, I'm dividing by 8 to do it a little bit less harsh.
Right, to get your desired.
Yeah, and for instance, here the color balance is a RGB value. So I'm increasing the red value and I'm decreasing the green and the blue value, making the colors super red. So
very cool. I like
and
that
that's
a lot.
it. Yeah, that's it for and you can, if you got this code example, which is all in the links, you can go to export a zip, and there you will have the source code, but also code that you can just host, and then you have a working website.
Very cool, very cool, and thank you so much for making that available so people can grab it, experiment, try out with their own models. That was awesome. This is, like I say, like I'm got some idea about JavaScript, but this really helps kind of just straighten out the concepts a lot. So I'm really thankful for that, and hopefully people that are watching the stream also are finding this useful as well. If you stop sharing your screen, Klaas, then we've got a couple of questions from the chat from different people.
Of course.
So I will go straight to them. Danica Sapit has asked, can you change the Sketchfab Viewer background color via the API?
Yes, you can. Yep. There is again in the documentation, there is a section. Let me just quickly look it up so I'm not talking rubbish. There's a section called background, and there are two ways to go about. So you can change the background color of the Sketchfab iframe. So that would be the same background color system that you would be using on the sketchfab.com editor. You can actually also make the Sketchfab iframe background transparent, and then the background color of your web page that's underneath will show.
Okay.
Yeah. And you can also, so instead of setting the background color, you can also set an image background similar to how you would do it on Sketchfab.
Okay, awesome. So there are lots of options for customizing the background of the viewer. Danica also asked, how nuanced does the API get for user actions? For example, would I be able to detect a user is viewing the model from a certain angle?
Not directly, no. You can get the camera position whenever you view the model. And for instance, there's an event called camera start.
Mm-hmm.
And that means that whenever somebody starts moving the camera, so for instance, orbit,
Mm-hmm.
SketchUp will tell you, hey, camera is moving, do whatever you want. Whenever that happens, you can ask SketchFab, well, where is that camera?
Mm-hmm.
And you will get a position for the camera, for the target. And based on that information, you can calculate angles, or, if am I looking from the side or for the front? So you would have to do those calculations yourself, but SketchFab won't tell you directly.
Okay. Okay. So you figure out, okay, I want the camera in this position, looking at this at this angle, and when that is that condition is satisfied, trigger some kind of event. But you'd have to kind of log all of that information to then put into your code to make that happen.
Yes. Yeah, exactly.
Okay, cool. Jess also has a couple of questions. I have a few problems with converting an RGB color to albedo color values. Every time I tried it, it's either too light or too dark. When I let the current color show on the console, it shows very weird long values. How can I properly translate colors to albedo? Well, that's over my head.
Yeah, so that's a really good question. I was struggling with that as well in the beginning. So the albedo color, that is one of the color channels in a material of a Sketchfab material. And that is when you use the PBR material with the metalness system.
Mm-hmm.
So then the color value of the material is called albedo PBR, and that's an array of RGB values, and Sketchfab calls that a normalized RGB array, which is a color value between 0 and 1.
Mm-hmm.
So where in web development you would say this red color is like 255, which is red. In Sketchfab you would say this color value is 1. So if you would make a red color in Sketchfab, you would say to the Sketchfab API, make this color 100 for RGB. So that's
Okay.
1. If you ask Sketchfab, hey, tell me what color value this is, Sketchfab doesn't round these values. Like it is 0.85, and then you get like 15 digits. Fine. It's super precise. It doesn't really matter, but you can ignore most of those digits. If you use 2 or 3 digits, you're usually fine.
Okay.
So that's one of the things.
Mm-hmm.
Another thing is, when you work with HTML, you probably store these color values as 0 to 255 because it's just easier to work with in your mind.
Mm-hmm.
Similar to working with degrees as angles instead of radians. When you convert yourself these color values in the 0 to 255 to the 0 and 1 range, you need to apply a gamma correction. And that is pretty old school. It has something to do with the monitors, how they were working, the CRT monitors. But basically, it is a to the power of 2.2. I will see if I can find a quick code example. But you're absolutely right. If you take a mid gray, like 128 gray, and you convert it to a mid gray in Sketchfab, which would be 0.5, it is not the same color. You need to apply a color correction to that.
Okay. Oh, that's super interesting. Thanks. Jess has one more question, and then we've got just 2 more after that. Which file format do you recommend for the export? FBX, GLTF, or GLB? Do you want to answer that?
Yeah, well, I always work with FBX because I work with 3ds Max. So that's where I got all my experience from, and I know it works, and I can edit it. So that has my preference. I don't have any other insights. And I am sure that GLTF or GLB will work perfectly. I just don't have experience with those that much.
From my side, the two example models that we're using, I believe I downloaded the GLTF auto-converted file from Sketchfab, made some edits, and then just re-exported either GLTF or GLB up to Sketchfab. Is it fair to say, Klaas, that once the 3D model's in Sketchfab, it doesn't matter kind of what format it was, um, or
Well, so if you create interactive experiences where you want to show and hide parts or change materials, the most important things are the object names and the material names. You need to know those names, and you probably need to know them before somebody loads that website. Otherwise, it's just a really hard experience to develop something.
Mhm.
So the export process from your 3D software to Sketchfab needs to, those names need to survive in a somewhat predictable way. So we saw that the lid was actually called lid_0. Okay, now we can code around that. But if something that's called lid in your 3D software is converted to some long hashed ID, then you're in trouble. So now, sometimes CAD modeling software like Inventor or Revit tend to convert these things when they export to some formats. So
okay. It depends a bit, basically.
yeah, yeah. If it looks good in Sketchfab, it doesn't mean that you can work with it in the API. Not because the model is bad, but because of these names.
Okay, okay. That's good, good and interesting. We have finally a couple of questions from Tycho Magnetic Anomaly, who asks, how long did it take you to learn enough code to use the API effectively?
Well, I feel like that every day that I'm not using the API effectively. So now I've been, so the first configurator that we built was about 6 years ago. And when I look at that code, I kind of think, how did that happen? But we picked it up in like a couple of months.
Okay.
And showing and hiding parts, you need like look at the API documentation. There are like 4 or 5 functions that you use, and you're ready to go.
Mhm.
Um,
Okay.
so if you want to use the entire API, it will take you a bit because there are just so much to do.
Mhm.
But the basics, showing and hiding the objects, maybe changing the material here and there. There are so many code examples. If you know a little bit of JavaScript, you
Yeah.
can pick that up in a day.
Okay. Okay. So yeah, you came to the API with knowledge of JavaScript in the first place, and learning JavaScript is a whole different kettle of fish to learning a new API.
Yeah.
Okay, that's good to hear. And then final question. In your opinion, would attempting to learn the API without any code skills at all be hard?
Yes, I think so. So this API is web-based, so you would need to know JavaScript, HTML, CSS a little bit, not necessarily. Uh, but you need to have some foundation. You need to know what a function is, how to work with variables, um, and what a callback is. Those principles, you need to know some of it.
Right, so
And of
the
course,
concept.
yeah, exactly. So all these code examples, you could download these code examples and it will work. But then if you want to edit it, you're kind of confined to changing an angle here and there. But if you want to modify a function or change the callback, it might get a little bit blurry. So
Mm, mm.
yes, I would recommend having some of that experience.
So it basically takes some time to wrap your head around, and yeah, I think that's fair fair to say of most things,
Yeah.
if you've got the time.
Yeah, and you also need to know a little bit of the 3D model, right? It is no, you not necessarily you don't need to be able to make a 3D model, but how does what's a hierarchy in a 3D model? That's super important.
Hmm. Hmm.
How are materials structured? What is a texture? Um, that's I would say that's maybe a bit more important than the coding part.
And so essentially, that's why people hire people like you. They have an idea of like, I want my 3D model. Say they have a 3D model. I want my
Yeah,
3D model to be on my website and stuff to happen. like whether you click a button, the model, the slider, anything. But they don't necessarily want to spend months learning how to do that.
That's true. Yeah.
Um, okay. Well, I think that's it for the questions.
Excellent.
We've this is a good long stream, but I think we covered some really good content and ideas. So really, it just remains for me to say thank you very much, Klaas, for your time and expertise. I'm looking forward to going back and trying out some of these examples myself.
Excellent.
And what we'll do is we'll kind of tweak the stream, add in some chapter markers, and we'll kind of remind people they can watch it again. But I think it'll be a great resource for people looking to get into, well, the Sketchfab API, using the Sketchfab API, but also just an idea of how JavaScript can be used to manipulate things on the web. I think it's very
Excellent.
cool.
Thanks for having me, Tom.
You're very welcome. As I said, Klaas's website is in the description. You can also find a link to Klaas's Sketchfab account as well with some of the 3D models that he's got there. I really recommend going and looking at the examples on Klaas's website. They're pretty easy to find from the front page of different things that Klaas has built using the Sketchfab API. Really cool examples of the code's not available, is that fair to say? But the end experience is there. So hopefully that's an
Yeah.
inspiration for everyone as well. So I guess all that remains to be said is thank you for watching and wish you a very good holiday season, whatever you are up to. And we'll be back in January with another live stream. So please subscribe to the channel or follow us on social media or the blog if you're interested in our next stream. But yeah, we'll see you next time. Take care.
All right. Bye-bye.
Cheers. Bye.